Okay, so we have finished the first unit for our class. In this video, we're starting the second unit. In the second unit, we're going to continue to work primarily with expressions and how to simplify and work with expressions. The first type of expression we're going to work with is called a polynomial expression. And this is something that you have worked with before in other classes. And hopefully today's lesson and the lesson that comes after this one will feel very much like it's review, because we're going to just start with the very most basic concepts associated with polynomials. And I think that you will find that almost all of this you've done before. So with that said, let's get started with our learning objectives. On this video, we're going to introduce what a polynomial is. In that basic introduction, we're going to go over some terminology associated with polynomials. Remember, for our class, it's rare that we would ever ask you a specific definition, but these are all words that you will see used in our lectures, on our notes, in our tests, in our quizzes. And so these are words that you need to be familiar with and have a basic understanding of what they mean. Okay, but you don't have to be able to recite a word-for-word definition for them. And then you also need to be able to take a polynomial and put it into its standard form. So you're going to need to know what standard form is, what it looks like, and how to generate that. Okay, so since this is largely, this particular set of notes is largely just terminology, let's get started looking at them. The easiest way to talk about what these different words mean is to just simply look at an example of a polynomial and identify these different bits and pieces and parts to it. So here is an example of a polynomial like you would have worked with in a previous math class. Okay. So this is an expression. Obviously, it doesn't have an equal sign, so that makes it an expression. It's an expression that has both numbers and variables. It has operators that are connecting those things together. And this particular form of an expression is called a polynomial. What makes it a polynomial is that I have x's that are either multiplied, raised to a power, or added. They can also be subtracted. That's okay too. But that's it. None of my x's are inside of fractions. None of my x's have radicals or square roots, or some of the other things that we'll learn later, things like logarithms and what have you. None of the x's have any of those things going on. So when I focus on the x's, the only thing that happens to the x's is they either get added, subtracted, multiplied by a number, or raised to a power. And if the expression is limited to those three things, add, multiply, powers, if that's all that happens to my variables, then that's a polynomial expression. Okay, now that's kind of wordy. Fortunately, you don't have to be able to write a definition, but when you see a polynomial, you should know that it's a polynomial. So there's our first term. Our second term is term. Okay, our second word is term. The terms are the things that are separated by plus or minus signs. Okay, so this particular polynomial has three terms in it. Okay, let me give you a second polynomial example. That polynomial has four terms in it. The terms are the things that are separated by add and subtract signs. Okay, now one thing to make sure that you're clear with as far as terms are concerned, the sign in front of the term goes with the term. In other words, if I start with this one back here, the sign in front of it is a plus, so this is considered to be a positive term. Similarly, this is a positive term. This one down here, though, is a negative term, as is this one, a negative term. These are also all positive terms. So the sign that's in front of the term goes with the term. Okay, so terms can be both positive and negative. They can have x's, they might not have an x, but that's okay. Now, the term that goes in the front is your leading term, and that has on it a leading coefficient. So I'm moving on now to our next set of terms, the coefficients and the leading coefficients. Coefficients are the numbers that the x's get multiplied by. So in this particular polynomial up here, 2 is my first coefficient. It is the coefficient in the leading term. It's called the leading coefficient. 3 is also a coefficient. In this one down here, 4 is a coefficient, 5 is a coefficient. This coefficient is a little tricky, we have to be careful of. First of all, I don't see a number, so I have to remember that there's a sneaky ninja 1 hiding inside of there. Secondly, I also have to remember that this sign goes with the term. So the coefficient on this is actually a -1. Okay, that's my coefficient. Okay, now there are different teachers and different textbooks that handle the numbers at the end slightly differently. Some would call these coefficients where they think of the x as being raised to the 0 power, because remember, anything to the 0 power just equals 1. Other books will refer to these as being a constant, and that's how we're going to handle it in our class. In our class, we're going to think of the term that does not have any x's in it at all as simply being the constant term. Okay, so I've got 3 terms here. In this term, there's a coefficient of 2. In this term, there's a coefficient of 3. And in this last term, we're just going to think of this as being called the constants. Okay, so again, not really formal definitions that we're writing out. It's simply being able to recognize the constant when you see it. In this case, the constant, or in all these cases, the constant is the number that does not have a variable associated with it. The coefficients, on the other hand, do have variables that go with them. And the coefficient that comes first is called your leading coefficient. Okay, so that takes care of polynomial. It takes care of terms, the things that are being added or subtracted. It takes care of coefficients and constants. Last but not least, we have the degree. Okay, now there's actually 2 types of degrees, and maybe we ought to add this to our learning objectives. There's degree of a term, and there's also the degree of the polynomial. Okay, so let's take these in that order. The degree of the term is just simply referring to the exponents. Okay, so the coefficient is the number in front of the variable. The degree is the exponents. So if I think of this down here, this has a degree of 3. This has a degree of 2. This has a sneaky hidden ninja 1 for its degree. And then this one, the constant, is perhaps the trickiest of them all. It's considered to have a degree of 0, because 3, and actually I should say -3, right? Because the sign goes with it. -3 is the same as having a -3 times x to the 0 power, because x to the 0 power just equals 1. So that's the same as a -3 times 1, right? All of these things mean the same thing, or they have the same value. And so I can think of my constant like this. Now we said when we talked just a second ago about coefficients, we said some textbooks think of it this way, and they would call -3 a coefficient. In our class, we're not going to do that. But we are going to say that this term has a degree of 0. So we're kind of borrowing from both scenarios there. We're kind of treating this in both ways. When we're talking about degree, we're going to think of this as being x to the 0. And then when we're talking about coefficients, we're just going to call this the constant and not worry about it. Okay, so those are the degrees of the terms. The degrees of the terms are the exponents, and I can't forget that my constant has a degree of 0. Okay, the degree of the polynomial is just simply whatever the largest exponent is. So in this particular polynomial, my largest exponent is right there. So that polynomial has a degree of 2. In this polynomial, my largest exponent is right there. So that polynomial has a degree of 3. Okay, so that takes care of all of our terms and definitions and phrases that we need to be comfortable with. Recognizing a polynomial, knowing what the various terms of the polynomial is, and whether or not those terms are positive or negative. Recognizing the coefficient associated with each term, and again, whether or not that coefficient is positive or negative. And in particular, being able to find the leading coefficient and being able to find the constant. Lastly, we talked about the degree of each polynomial, the degree of each term, and the degree of the whole polynomial, and being able to identify those. The first several problems on your homework will just simply ask you questions like, What is the degree of this polynomial? What's the constant on this polynomial? What is the sign associated with this term? What is the coefficient on this term? Those types of questions are what you're going to see in the first part of the homework. Okay? In the second part of the homework, you're going to look at putting things in standard form. Now, to do this, we're going to work through multiple different examples, but as this video is already more than 10 minutes long, I'm going to save this for a second video that I'll post here in just a minute. So hopefully this gets you through the first half of our homework for today. Make sure you watch the second video for some examples of how to put polynomials in standard form, because those will definitely be that's definitely something you'll need to do in the homework tonight, as well as on our next test and our next quiz. Thanks for watching this video. Have a good one.